So our next speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Paul Siciliano, who's going to talk to us about some grazing systems for horses and how we can also incorporate our equine friends as well. Dr. Paul Siciliano is a professor of animal science and an equine extension specialist. He's also the departmental extension leader in animal science and has focused his research and outreach programs on the improved utilization of pastures for horses and other animals. He's done specific research on trace mineral nutrition, the intake rate of horses, and other equids. He's done specific research on trace mineral nutrition, the intake rate of horses on pasture, how forage management impacts non-structural carbohydrate levels in pastures, and the evaluation of various rotational grazing systems for horses. And I do know that he's also a lover of crabgrass for horse grazing systems. So with that, Dr. Siciliano, I'll give you the floor to tell us a little bit about how we can make this work in our equine systems.
All right. Well, thank you, Deidre, and welcome everybody. Go ahead and I'll get my presentation up here. Okay, looks good from my end. Okay on yours?
Yep, looks great. We can hear you and we can see your presentation as well.
All righty. Well, one of the things that we're going to see tonight is that hopefully pasture is really a valuable nutritional resource for horses, but you only get the full value out of it when you manage those horses grazing that pasture. And when you do that, it's good for the health of the horse. It's good for the health of the pasture. And there's some financial benefit to it as well, because we're not having to feed supplemental feeds or hay as much as part of the year. So let's talk a little bit about what a well-managed grazing system is for horses. And to do that, we've got to understand a couple of things. One, we should understand a little bit about grazing behavior of horses. Two, we want to understand the nutritional value of pasture, and we want to understand it relative to what the horse requires in different feeding classes, okay? And then we're going to come back and revisit just very, very briefly a topic that Dr. Harmon talked about here last week, some of the principles of pasture plant growth. We can't forget that. We'll take those three items and we'll roll those into developing some management strategies that we can use to regulate pasture intake so that we best match that intake with the requirement of the horse, and then also protect that valuable resource, our pasture, and sustain that pasture productivity over time. So let's start out and talk a little bit about the grazing behavior of horses. Horses are periodic grazers. They like to eat small, frequent meals throughout the day and the night. Even if we take a horse out of a pasture setting, we put him in a dry lot with a round bale like these horses over here on the right-hand side of the screen, they'll still eat like that, small, frequent meals. And the reason for that is it is good for the health of their GI tract. That's how their GI tract was designed, to have a continuous flow of ingesta, predominantly fibrous ingesta, going through there, and that really keeps that GI tract healthy. So grazing is valuable for the health of that horse's GI tract. Now, one of the other things about horses and how they graze, they not only like small, frequent meals, but they're kind of selective about what they graze. Dr. Poor hit on this a couple of weeks ago, talking about how those horses can use those prehensile lips and incisors a little differently than some of the other species, and they can really get down to some of the better parts of the plant, and they can kind of pick and choose. That's probably good for them in some ways, but there's some problems with that. And this particular slide shows some GPS data for a single horse over the course of a week. And it's kind of this heat map style graph, and you can see this red spot here. That's actually where the watering tank was. And over here, this yellow is just an area that they like to loaf in. So they obviously visited those areas very, very frequently, and that shows up on this. But look at all these other areas where they kind of concentrated their time and presumably their grazing, and the pasture did in fact reflect that. And then all these other areas that they don't really spend a lot of time. Now, again, not that they never went there at all, they did, but this shows you that they're kind of selective and they don't necessarily graze uniformly if they don't have to. Okay. Now, when they do that, that selective grazing, it's inefficient because take a look at this slide. You've got this whole area in the background, this really mature forage. Sometimes it's near latrine areas. This is underutilized forage. We really are not using it for the horse. And then we have these areas that they tend to concentrate on, and they'll graze it down, and then they get nice tender regrowth, and they go back, and it's really immature, really palatable. And ultimately, they end up overgrazing this, and it leads to the degradation of the pasture. And this, they just don't use as well. And so we'd like to promote a little more uniform grazing with the horse, and we can sure do it through management principles. Here's Johnny's Power of One wire. You can see that's just a 1/2-inch poly tape, electrified poly tape. And these are just a couple of geldings with maintenance requirements. And if you look in that little segment, look how nice and uniform that area is where they're grazing. On the foreground, that's what was there beforehand. This is some really mature tall fescue. In fact, some of it's already kind of headed out and turned brown. But by constraining or restricting where they can graze, all of a sudden, they're not as selective as they used to be. So we can manage around that, and there's some benefit in doing that. One of the other things we should know about horse grazing behavior is they've got a pretty good capacity for pasture intake. If we look at this graph, it kind of shows us that their intake ranges from 1.5% of body weight clear up to almost 3.5% of body weight in dry matter, with an average of around 2.5%. Several factors influence that. The physiological status of the horse. So these dots up here represent growing horses, lactating mares. They've got a really high requirement. The available forage can also influence that. So if there's a real dense stand of forage, every mouthful they get more forage. And so the intake is a little higher. If the quality of the forage is high, they don't have to chew it as much, and they can kind of get more down the throat and consume more. Whereas when the forage is not as available and the quality is not as high, they might be down here. The take-home message here, I'll use a little example to kind of make the point. If we look at 3 average horses, 1,200 pounds or so, and they're eating this average of around 2.5%, that's about 90 pounds a day. And if you look at an acre of decently quality pasture, that's only going to last about 14 days, all right? And so if we really think about this, the horse, if unmanaged, has got a high potential for overgrazing. So we want to be mindful of that. So if we summarize the grazing behavior of horses, they like to graze small, frequent meals throughout the day and the night, and that's good for their GI health. They can be selective. We can manage around that. And given that selectivity and this high capacity for pasture intake, we can also have overgrazing along with underutilization in the very same pasture. And that's something we need to consider as well in our management plan. So now let's switch and talk a little bit about the nutritional value of pasture relative to the horse's requirements. Pasture is an excellent source of nutrients, and it's really, really an excellent source of calories for horses. And I'll use this graph to demonstrate that. So this shows the digestible energy requirements in megacalories per kilogram of dry matter for the horse. This little green area here gives us kind of the range and the average of what we might expect to see in a well-managed pasture. And you can see when we look across different feeding classes, maintenance with the lowest requirements, young growing horse with some of the highest requirements, that pasture is pretty good, especially for this horse at maintenance. Okay, it far exceeds this horse's requirement. And so given that, in our management plan, we may want to have some methods and strategies that we can maybe minimize intake so we don't get overconsumption, wasting resources and getting horses that are overconditioned. That's not good either. Okay. Alternatively, we might have some horses with really high requirements like these weanlings, where that pasture won't quite meet their requirement, but we want to do everything we can do to maximize the intake so it meets as much of it as possible. Okay, so again, the take home here is that pasture is an excellent source of calories. And I should mention too that the majority of dry matter consumed by the horse, or the majority of calories that are consumed by the horse, makes up the bulk of the dry matter that's consumed by the horse. So it can be one of the limiting requirements. So pasture is an excellent source of calories. If we go down the list and we look at the other nutrients too, pasture is a great source of crude protein too. Horses, relatively speaking, maybe with the exception of growing horses, lactating mares, have a fairly low protein requirement. So pasture is a good source of that. Fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin K, great source there. And when we go down the list and get to calcium and phosphorus, some of the macro minerals in there, they're varied. Sometimes, depending on the requirements of the horse, they may meet it, they may not. Usually supplementation's in order there. And when we get to things like sodium and chloride, some of the trace minerals, all the trace minerals, usually we require some supplementation for the horse. But all in all, pasture is really a great source of nutrients. Now, because it's a valuable nutritional resource, we want to protect that resource. And to do that, we've got to go back to, again, some of those principles that Dr. Harmon talked about last time. And I'm just going to summarize it really in a slide. This is kind of the golden rule of grazing. No matter what you do, no matter what system you use, you've got to monitor that plant. You need to know when to start. And for most forage, it's maybe somewhere in this 8 to 10 inches. It could be a little more, depending on the forage. It could be a little bit less, but we want to start grazing here and we want to stop when they're around 3 to 4 inches. And when we do that, by starting here, we have a nice forage that's not too mature. It's a high quality, high nutritional value, digestibility, and so forth. When we stop here, we're conserving those energy reserves, allowing for regrowth. And when we do all that, we go back to what Steve Woodruff talked about last time as well, that we're protecting the ground cover, we're keeping that live root and really promoting the health of the plant, the soil, and the entire system. So know when to start and know when to stop to protect that resource. So let's take information that we've talked about in these first 3 items now and see how we put that into some management strategies used to try and regulate the intake of pasture to best match it with the horse's requirements. And in turn, also keep in mind that we want to protect that plant. We want to sustain that pasture productivity. So one of the ways that we can do this is by constraining the amount of time and space allocated for grazing. Let's talk a little bit about constraining time first. So there are some feeding classes of horses that we talked about just a few minutes ago that really don't need to be out there 24 hours a day. If they are, they're consuming well over their required amount. That would be our mature idle horse at maintenance. We've done some research that shows that 8 to 12 hours per day will meet those energy requirements in most cases and maintain a good body condition, good body weight across a long period of time. That's even true when we move up to light work. It's about 20% above maintenance requirements. We're just on the upper end of that 8 to 12 at 10 to 12 hours. The same is true there. Now, again, we might need some supplementation with minerals for those horses, but we're meeting all those other requirements. And we can do that really just by simply turning those horses out, bringing them back into the to a stall or a pen. Oftentimes we'll provide them with some source of maybe a mature forage just so they have something to eat on and keep that gut full. But a lot of times when you turn them out in that 8 to 10 hour range, they really don't touch that forage. They stay full. It works quite well. The grazing muzzle is another approach. It's got a hole in the bottom of it. It allows that horse to consume a little bit, somewhere between 1/3 to 0.5% of their body weight. This is another strategy you can use. You take that off, let them graze, for a period of time, put it back on. This one's a little harder to manage in my experience because they're real good about letting you take that muzzle off. They're not so keen when you come back to put it back on. This is a little easier approach and a little gives you a little more control. So we can regulate the amount of time, we can regulate the amount of space. And again, we go back here to this power of one wire. Horses will, for sure, stand behind a single strand of poly tape. They learn how to do it quite well. And even they'll tolerate this when the power is out for a few days until they figure it out. So we can do this and we can allocate an area for grazing and constrain. We can either use this to restrict intake, or we can use this to help maximize intake. And let me just show you an example of how we might use this. So we've got 8 horses out here. These are horses at maintenance. They weigh about 1,200 pounds. And we're going to assume their dry matter intake's about 2.5% of body weight. Now, this could be as low as 2% if we're trying to restrict the intake. Perhaps we have horses that we really, think they're over-conditioned, or we don't want them to get over-conditioned. We can reduce that. Or maybe we've got some young growing horses or lactating mares. We could bump this up to 3.5%. But in this particular example, we left it at 2.5%. So they eat 30 pounds a day. If we've got 8 head and we leave them in this area that we're going to calculate the size of for 7 days. Now, this length of stay that they're in here for could be anywhere from 1 to 7 days. With 7 days, they're going to start trampling this forage down somewhere maybe around day 3, 4, 5. And it will slow this intake down a little bit. So maybe, again, we've got that group of horses that we're trying to restrict intake. If we leave it in there a little bit longer, maybe we even get a little, dampening of this intake. On the other hand, if we've got horses with a high requirement, this might be 1 to 3 days, and we're giving them fresh forage and we're maximizing that intake. At any rate, you can play with this and make it fit your needs, your horses. But with this, we calculated up that they need 1,680 pounds. And then we calculate the supply, 3,500 pounds of dry matter per acre. How do I get that? You can use a grazing stick. And again, if you go on YouTube, Google and search this, or Google and search it, some great information out there. It basically correlates the herbage mass with the height of the forage. There's a little table on the stick that calculates this. And when we do that, we get the total amount of forage that's in there. We don't want to graze it to the ground. We're going to use a factor of 50%. It could range up to maybe 75%. 50% is a good place to start when you're trying to figure this out. And again, you can tinker with it a little bit. So if we do this, we get 1,750 pounds available for grazing. That's our supply. We take our demand, divide it by our supply. It tells us for these 8 horses, we need about an acre for these horses to graze a week to get that 2.5% of body weight. Given a rest period of 3 to 4 weeks, it means we need 4 to 5 acres to make this system work. When it does work, this is an example of what it looks like. In this particular situation, we had some poly tape behind and in front. These horses graze this for a week. Here's an area that's ungrazed, and then they'll come back to this regrowth. It'll be 4 weeks now, and they're ready to go through this system again. In order to make this one work, we've got to have a water source that moves with these different cells. And in this particular one, along the fence line, we have a water line that has these points with quick connects on them. We plug this quick connector in there. It's attached to a hose plumbed into a water tank with a float valve on it. And there we go. Sometimes horses will get in there and paw on these, so you may need to put some protection around that or duck it under the fence a little bit, but it works quite well. Now, not everybody may have that. Here's a situation where we didn't, and we started out with a single strand of wire here. Horses were behind there. They had access to the water. We took that down and just moved this forward. This was what Deidre talked about, this kind of frontal grazing. So they graze this area, took that down. Now they're grazing there. We see the water back here, and they really followed this. We're actually grazing an area outside the pasture, and you can see it's not very high quality forage. They grazed it down nice. We didn't have to mow it, and we utilized some forage for these horses. So we could also build a lane here, as Johnny talked about, back to water. The opportunities and the options are really endless, and you can be kind of creative with this. It also works in a small acreage as well. You know, sometimes we think about this with horses. A lot of times a horse is on a fairly small area. In this case, we've done things really, really small. We've got just about 3/4 of an acre. There's a little pony in here, and you can see here's an area resting. Here's an area that just got grazed. Here's the area with the pony. We've got a little mobile shade in there, water that we just filled it up with a watering hose. And then here's an area where this horse can graze several other allocations and start over. And this lasted, this little pony clear through the entire grazing season, around 8 months or so. So you can see it's not just for, large herds of horses or bigger pastures. You can do it on a small scale as well. Now, all of this stuff might seem a little bit complicated. Oh my goodness, how do I know if I'm getting things right? Well, the horse will tell you. Here's a horse giving me the update on how things are going, and how they tell you that is, when you go out there to look at the allocation and say, okay, did I make it big enough? Well, if those horses are, nickering and pushing up against that wire, maybe you shorted them a little bit. And you also have to look at the grass. The grass will tell you too. If they overgrazed it a little bit, we'll make the allocation just a little bit bigger. And over time, you'll get this figured out. It is a little bit of an art and a science. So the horse and the grass can kind of tell you short term whether you're getting it right. Long term, we can look at things like body condition scoring. Here's our horse with an ideal body condition score. We don't see any ribs, not a lot of fat over the top line. This horse looks great. Here's a thin one though. We don't want to see these ribs kind of sunken in around the neck. We can see, again, the hook and the pin bones, little sunken in over the top. And then on the other end of the spectrum, here's one that, is a little more efficient. This horse has this big cresty neck, kind of a hump of fat there in the neck, a lot of fat over the top and the tail head. And if we could try to touch those ribs and feel them, we probably couldn't on this particular horse. So the horse will tell you long-term and short-term whether or not you're getting things right. And then again, going back to what Dr. Poor talked about, we can use pasture condition scoring from the NRCS. This is a great way to tell how we're doing, over the growing season, over the course of the year, over time. Those are all things that we need to take in consideration. So hopefully we understand now, or at least have a little bit of basis for developing management strategies that regulate intake. They're either going to restrict the intake or maximize the intake to best match that horse's requirements. They're going to do it in a way too that protects that resource, it protects that plant, so that we have that to come back to again and again and again, and that's what we're after. Now, one last thing that I'll leave you with: eventually, that pasture is going to run out in most situations, right? Here in North Carolina, if we had enough pasture and we managed it properly, we could for sure graze year round. Okay. But for most people, it's going to run out. When it does, we've got to have somewhere to go with those horses. This shows a nice dry lot. This is one at the university. This is kind of an engineered surface. It drains well. This particular one will take a hurricane rain, and it's there's no mud. It's really nice. But this dry lot may be as simple as just an area of your pasture that you're going to take that single strand of poly tape and cordon it off, and that's where you're going to feed hay to those horses while the pasture rests or until it comes back. So with that, I'm going to wind up, and there's a whole lot of things that we could have talked about that we didn't in this time frame. So again, any questions you have regarding the presentation, ask them in the chat. Anything that we didn't cover is fair game as well. So thanks for your attention, and Deidre will turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Siciliano. Like Dr. Siciliano said, that we are going to hold all the questions till the end. So if you have questions and you're afraid you're going to forget that you have that question, you can go ahead and type those questions in the chat box, and we'll pull that chat box up and get to those questions at the end of the presentations. So thank you, Dr. Siciliano, for talking to us about kind of grazing management and how we can better manage our pastures with our equine friends.